Sawate discipuli, hodie dicamos de nested clauses. And so let's dive into it. All right, a new concept. And so before we begin, let's look at some of our goals from this video. Number one, we want to after this video, hopefully we'll have a better understanding of a key organizational structure of the Latin language. If you've ever been translating a sentence, especially a longer sentence, and there's multiple verbs and you're kind of like, well, what words go with what? Hopefully by the end of this video, you have a better ability to organize which words go with which verbs in a Latin sentence. And then tied into this mainly is having a better sense of when a clause begins and ends. And nested clauses, because nested clauses are going to be those clauses in the middle of a larger clause. And so that's a lot of grammar mumbo jumbo. We're going to look at some concrete examples soon. But before we do that, another way to think of this is we are used to translating with these unit sheets. And remember, if it's indented, that means it's a subordinate clause. It's not part of the main clause, which is on that main line here. So anything that's not indented like this is part of a main clause. If it's indented, it's part of a subordinate clause. If it's indented again, it's part of a subordinate clause of a subordinate clause. But while we've been like, oh, this is nice and it helps organize things, it's important for us to also know how and why these indentations are happening. And by the end of this video, hopefully we'll have a better sense of why at least some of those indentations happen. Okay, so let's look immediately at some exempla latina. And so when I look at a sentence like this, and when I see two verbs in it that both are conjugated, that tells me that there are at least two clauses. And so I want to connect, well, what words go with each verb here? And so in this sentence, what gives it away to me is I see a word like qui, which is a relative pronoun. And relative pronouns can introduce a subordinate clause. So if I see a word like qui, qui, quod in the middle of a Latin sentence, it's usually a good idea to box it off. Generally, that clause will then end at the next verb. Specifically, will end when the meaning of its clause ends. But exactly what that means we won't worry about right now. Just know that that could mean that this could also be written sometimes as qui est imperator. But you just need, as we get better, most of the time, the est will mark the end of the clause. But it's important to know that the est can also come before imperator in this context, and you could still understand, right? Because you would hear who is the emperor, and you know, okay, that idea is contained. Any other words here are going to be part of the main clause with Caesar. So you box this off, and then you have two clauses, Caesar Romam rediit and qui imperator est. So Caesar, who is the emperor, returned to Rome. Next one here, Caesar dum senatores curiam intrabat non adsurgit. Again, I see two verbs, intrabat and adsurgit. I see dum, which is a subordinating conjunction. And don't worry if you're like, how did you know that? I'll give you a list of some common subordinating conjunctions soon after the slide. And I suggest in the short term, you kind of keep those near you to reference as you translate. But I see dum. The next verb is intrabat. So I can feel pretty good about this being the end of its clause. And so I have two clauses here. Caesar non adsurgit, Caesar does not rise, or I should say did not rise, would make more sense here, while the senators were entering the curia, which is the Senate house. So Caesar did not rise while the senators were entering, there should be an NT here, were entering the curia, okay? So again, I knew that it starts at the subordinating conjunction as opposed to a relative clause here. It ends at the next verb. Last one. Caesar cum ad curiam venisset vulneribus confusus est. So we see two verbs, venisset, that OST must dissent ending, and confusus est. And so I'm going to need to find some kind of subordinating conjunction or relative pronoun. Here it's kind of a tricky one if you don't remember your cum clauses, But this cum, right, when cum is not followed by an ablative, we can translate it as when, since, or although. So cum is a subordinating conjunction. When nisset's its next verb, so I can box it off. And then we have Caesar was stabbed by wounds, right? Or in left to right order, Caesar, when he had come to the Curia, the Senate house, remember, was stabbed. He was stabbed with wounds. Okay, good. So let's take a quick look at what these look like in English. And note that in English, we also have this idea. We can do nested clauses, right? We can have a clause within the main clause. So I could say Caesar, who is emperor, contained within the main clause, returned to Rome. Caesar, while the senators were entering the Curia, did not rise. So Latin and English both have these. The nice thing about Latin is frequently the verb of the nested clause comes at the end, which allows us to know that all of these words are part of the nested clause. Whereas in English, right, you kind of just have to hear it, which is ultimately where we want to get to with Latin as well. But in the short term, we can use this verb, this common scenario where the verb comes at the end of its clause as a sort of a cheat. Nice. So, quick review of the rules. Where do subordinate clauses start? At a subordinate conjunction or a relative pronoun. Here's a short list. Qui, quae, quod are relative pronouns, and then utur ne, which introduce subjunctive usages, a lot of subjunctive usages, which we'll see soon. Dum, while. Cum, which can mean when, since, or although, when not followed by the ablative, and we'll review that later this term as well. Postquam, after. Ubi, when. Quando, another word for when. Ubi can also mean where. And si, which means if, a conditional, which will be one of the other things we review this term. Okay, so here's a good useful list that you can keep on hand. Maybe one other one you can put on here is quam. So I suggest you pause the video and take a second to just write these down. And in the short term, just keep them by your side. But really, it's just any Latin word that means a word that can introduce a subordinate clause in English. That can introduce a new verb, okay? And where does the clause end? It ends when the meaning of the clause is complete, and that usually means the verb. So it normally ends at the next verb. All right, a lot of information there. I'll give you another, we're gonna have another chance to look at some of these, or for you to practice them in a second. Finally, the last thing is that's important to remember is that the first clause won't pick back up until the old clause finishes. Okay, so you're never gonna have something in Latin that's like qui imperator Romam reddit est, where you're saying like Caesar, who emperor returns to Rome is, right? Just like you can't do that in English. You can't go back to the main clause and get this other information until you finish this subordinate clause that you began, right? I can't say Caesar, who is returned to Rome, the emperor, right? I need to finish this whole thought before I go back to the main clause, okay? So the nice thing is once you see this qui, if you haven't had a verb yet for anything before it, you can feel pretty good that, ooh, okay, so I'm gonna find out whatever Caesar's doing in the main clause after this subordinate clause ends. All right, last thing. Oh, so actually first, now you try. Here are two example sentences. Try and pull out, separate the subordinate clause from the main clause. All right, now that you've had a chance to do that, check this out. We see quo, relative clause, and I'm going to go until the next verb, transierat. Boom. So if I was to separate this, it would be Caesar in Graecia contra Pompeium pugnavit, and quo ab Hispania transierat. Caesar in Greece, to which place he had crossed from Spain, fought against Pompey. Rex Ptolemaeus in Aegypto postquam, that was one of our subordinating conjunctions. Discipulus Pompeii fuerat, that's a verb, boom, tamen eam nicavit. Rex, King Ptolemy in Egypt, after he had been a student of Pompey, nevertheless killed him, meaning Pompey. Bene. A couple of quick addenda. Coordinating conjunctions like nec, a, que, or sed, right? Essentially words that mean and or but, can extend a nested clause if they follow the subordinate verb. A lot of mumbo jumbo. Quickly, an example: inter conjuratos duo Bruti ex genere Bruti, qui. So among the conspirators, two Brutuses from the family of Brutus, who, subordinate clause, had been the first consul of Rome, and so that end, after following the verb that I would have expected to end this subordinate clause, because there's an et after that verb, I know that actually the subordinate clause keeps going. So I'm going to find out more about the family of Bruti, the family of the Brutus who had been the first consul of Rome and who had expelled the kings of Rome, implied. So I know that the qui is working with both fuerat and expulerat because the et follows the next verb. And then that this part of the sentence would go with the main clause. So it's among the conspirators there were two Brutuses from the family of the Brutus who had been the first consul of Rome and had expelled the kings. Oh, and there was C. Cassius too. He was another conspirator. Okay. Finally, subordinate clauses can have their own subordinate clause. Now this is where it gets kind of particularly twisty, but it also kind of becomes an interesting little scavenger hunt. So when we see this sentence, I read, I get to a verb, I get to a relative clause. So now I'm like, ooh, okay. So boom, new clause begins. I'm going to go to the next verb, deferabantur. So I'm like, boom, that clause ends. I'm now part of this first clause, which remember started with cum, meaning that it is a subordinate clause. So we haven't even gotten to the main clause yet. So I get to nec, which means I'm part of this main clause again. Keep going to my next verb. I get to adsurgeret. And so I'm like, oh, I'm done. But look at this pesky little que. So I know that this que actually is the same, right? Because it's attached to the second word. It's the same as saying et alia regia ac paene tyrannica faceret. So now I know that actually all three of these words are all part of this clause with cum. I get to faceret, and now I'm like, all right, now I'm done that cum clause because there's no et or sed here. And then I get coniuratum est in eam a sexaginta vel amplius senatoribus equitibus quae Romanis. This is just one big by clause, personal agent, and this is the final verb in the main clause. Okay, so we have praestaret, adsurgeret, and faceret all working with cum in a long subordinate clause when he was bestowing honors from his own will, which were being given or being passed along previously by the people. And this is all referring to Caesar. This is actually in our reading, so it's a good thing to pay attention to. And also, so when he was bestowing honors from his own will, and he was not nec, rising for the Senate coming to him, and also when he was doing other kingly and almost tyrannical things, it was plotted, coniuratum est, against him, and him being Caesar, because he was doing all this crazy stuff, and it was plotted against him by 60 or more senators and Roman knights. All right, so this is an example of how it can have its own subordinate clause. So I'm in a subordinate clause, and then I have a subordinate clause within that. Final test. This sentence has actually 3 clauses in it. And you might know that because you might, if you look carefully, see 3 verbs. Try and split apart these 3 clauses using everything we've learned so far in this video. Bonam fortunam. We'll talk more about this in class. Walete.